Elijah Boone is 76 years old. A retired Marine, a man who once carried wounded soldiers through enemy fire with nothing but grit and faith. This morning he sat quietly on a park bench outside Crestfield Middle School, dressed in his old uniform, waiting to teach 8th graders about service sacrifice and courage. But what happened next wasn't part of any lesson plan. Within minutes, 3 local police officers surrounded him. One accused him of loitering, another shoved him. They threw Elijah Boone to the ground and cuffed him right where the children were meant to greet him. They didn't ask his name. They didn't check his invitation. They didn't care about his story. But 30 minutes later, the FBI walked into Crestfield Courthouse without a word. No sirens, no warnings, just cold, hard files and a reckoning decades overdue, because in a country where honor can be erased faster than its earned dignity doesn't ask to be believed, it just waits for someone brave enough to watch. Where are you watching from today? Drop your city or country in the comments. And if you believe some voices are too important to be silenced, like, share, and subscribe for more stories that uncover the truth, no matter how long it's been buried. At 7:43 a.m., Elijah Boone sat alone on a weathered park bench just outside Crestfield Middle School. He wore his old Marine Corps jacket buttons, polished collar straight, and rested a small duffel bag beside him. Inside were his notes, a folded flag, and a Bronze Star citation he'd planned to show the students. The principal had invited him to speak about service and courage. He had arrived early. He always did. His back was straight, his gaze steady, and despite the morning chill, his hands rested calmly on his knees. He had faced enemy fire in Khe Sanh. This was just another quiet morning in America. Until it wasn't. A patrol car pulled up without sirens. Then a second. Doors slammed. Sergeant Dean Rowley stepped out first, stocky red-faced with mirrored sunglasses he never removed. Officer Liam Grant followed, his eyes downcast. Officer Maria Diaz trailed behind, already unhooking her baton. Rowley marched toward the bench. Got a report of a suspicious person loitering near school grounds, he barked. Elijah raised an eyebrow. I'm waiting for a school official. I'm supposed to speak. Stand up, Rowley snapped. Hands where I can see them. Elijah didn't move. You can check my ID. My name's Elijah Boone. I served. Yeah, Rowley smirked. So did half the bums under the freeway. Get up, old man. From a classroom window above the courtyard, a student named Marcus Lang, 13 years old, quiet, curious, pressed his phone against the glass and hit record. He had heard the commotion and recognized the man on the bench. His class had been told Mr. Boone was coming. When Elijah stood slowly, Rowley shoved him back down with both hands. I said, don't move unless I tell you to, he growled. You think wearing that jacket gives you a free pass? I served this country, Elijah said, his voice low. Is this how you treat veterans? I treat threats like threats. Rowley snapped, then signaled to Diaz. Cuff him. Officer Grant hesitated. Sarge, maybe we should call the school first. He's not. Rowley cut him off. Do it. Diaz moved in, grabbed Elijah's arm, twisted it behind his back, and clamped the cuffs on with a sharp metallic click. Elijah winced but didn't resist. He had learned long ago that dignity didn't mean fighting back. It meant not giving them more than they were already taking. From the window, Marcus kept filming. A small crowd of students and parents began to gather across the street. Some whispered. One parent raised her phone. No one stepped forward. Elijah was pushed toward the patrol car. What am I being charged with? He asked. You'll find out, Rowley said. Now shut up. As the car door slammed behind him, Marcus hit send. The video uploaded to his private group chat. Within minutes, someone shared it publicly. By the time the cruiser pulled out of Lincoln Park, the footage had already been viewed over 1,000 times. Back inside the car, Elijah said nothing. He stared out the window at the school entrance growing smaller behind them. His notes, his flag, his medals still on that bench unattended. He hadn't even made it past the gate. Rowley turned the radio volume up, drowning out the silence with static. Grant kept his eyes on the dashboard. Diaz stared straight ahead, jaw clenched. No one asked Elijah a single question. No one offered a phone call. He wasn't read his rights. He wasn't even addressed by name. At the station, they logged him in as uncooperative male suspect, African-American elderly. No mention of his military ID. No record of his school invitation. And yet the video kept spreading, shared by students, picked up by local groups, then picked up again by someone with a real following. The town didn't know it yet, but something had already cracked. Because dignity once captured on video doesn't beg to be believed. It just waits for someone to watch. The precinct doors opened. Elijah Boone was led out in cuffs, now heading towards the local courthouse. The charges still vague. The explanation non-existent. And as he crossed the threshold of justice, one thing had become clear. Honor may be earned on the battlefield, but it can be erased by a single pair of blind eyes. What came next wouldn't be an ordinary arraignment. It would be the beginning of a reckoning. The doors to Crestfield Courthouse creaked open just before 9, and the light pouring through the stained windows cast pale streaks across the polished wood floor. Inside, a low murmur hung in the air as early arrivals took their seats, court regulars, clerks, and a few bored observers waiting to see what kind of case might liven up an otherwise ordinary docket. They weren't prepared for what entered next. Elijah Boone stepped into the courtroom, flanked by 2 officers. His shoulders were square, despite the tightness of the cuffs, his steps slow but even. The Marine jacket hung on him like it had always belonged, even now creased and faded from years of wear. No one stood. No one acknowledged the weight of what he wore or the decades behind him. He moved not like a criminal, but like someone used to walking into danger. And yet here, his presence was treated like a threat. Behind the bench, Judge Charles Rohr adjusted his glasses and barely lifted his eyes. He tapped his fingers against the wood expression, unreadable voice clipped, as he said, "Bring in the defendant." Officer Liam Grant looked uneasy as he helped guide Elijah toward the defense table. Sergeant Rowley, smirking slightly, nudged Grant in the side as they walked past. "Look at him. Thinks the uniform makes him untouchable," he muttered. Elijah said nothing. He'd been trained to measure his words carefully, even when words were the only thing left to fight with. At the prosecution table, Assistant District Attorney Nathan Hensley flipped through his paperwork with practiced indifference. Young, sharp, and smug, he glanced up just long enough to sneer. "This what passes for trouble in Crestfield now," he said under his breath. The court clerk called the case. State of Georgia v. Elijah Boone, charge of disorderly conduct and failure to comply with law enforcement in a public space. Maya Brooks stood as defense counsel. Crisp suit, steady posture. She was barely 35, but her presence anchored the room like a weight too solid to ignore. Before anything else could begin, someone else could. Rowley stepped forward with a yellow form in hand. "Your Honor, he said we'd like the defendant to sign a voluntary admission of misconduct. Standard protocol for minor disturbances. Avoids wasting court time." Maya's eyes narrowed. No one discussed this with defense counsel. Rowley shrugged. "He can sign or not, but it's a courtesy." He placed the form on the defense table in front of Elijah. It was already filled out, charging him with verbal aggression, refusal to comply, and unlawful loitering near a school zone. Elijah looked at the paper, then at Maya. "They told me I was being held for questioning. No one said anything about charges." Maya's voice was low but firm. "Don't sign that." Hensley rolled his eyes. "Let's not pretend this is some civil rights moment." The man refused lawful instructions. He raised his voice. The officers felt threatened. Grant shifted in his seat. Judge Rohr cleared his throat. "Mr. Boone, do you wish to enter a plea?" Elijah raised his head. "I came to teach," he said. "I didn't raise my voice until no one would answer me." The courtroom fell silent. Maya stepped forward. "My client was invited to speak at Crestfield Middle School by the principal herself. He was detained while waiting for the school transport in full view of students and staff. This is not a case of disorderly conduct. It's a case of wrongful arrest." Judge Rohr didn't react. "Plea not guilty," Maya replied. Behind her, Grant's jaw tightened. It was then that Marcus Lang's video began circulating among courtroom staff phones. A bailiff leaned over to whisper to another. A clerk frowned. And in the gallery a woman gasped softly as she watched a shaky clip of Elijah being cuffed for sitting quietly on a bench. But the courtroom in its design favored silence. A man who had once pulled wounded soldiers from burning vehicles under enemy fire now stood accused of disrupting peace for existing while black. A man who had carried men out of combat zones with his bare hands now had to defend himself against paperwork written by people who never asked him a single question. The people watching may not have known his record, but they knew enough to be uncomfortable. Still, the process moved forward. Judge Rohr marked the plea, then turned to set a preliminary hearing. The form sat on the defense table, unsigned, still a silent accusation. Rowley, irritated, retrieved it with a sigh. As the gavel fell to adjourn the opening session, Grant avoided Elijah's eyes. But something in his chest twisted. He had been there that morning. He had watched it happen. And as much as he had told himself it wasn't his decision, he knew it wasn't just the sergeant's voice he'd obeyed. He had chosen silence. Now that silence was echoing. Maya glanced at Elijah, then at the bench and back at the prosecution. If they thought this case would fold easily, they hadn't read the wrong file, they'd picked the wrong man. Because when someone spends their life following orders, it takes more than intimidation to make them kneel. And the courtroom had only just met Maya Brooks. The gavel cracked once more as Judge Charles Rohr adjusted in his seat, his expression still unreadable. The preliminary hearing had moved fast, too fast for anyone outside the system to follow. Elijah Boone sat silent at the defense table, his wrists red from the handcuffs that had just been removed. Maya Brooks stood beside him, calm on the surface, but her jaw tensed each time she heard the word disturbance used to describe her client's presence in a public park. She raised a file above the table without being prompted. "Your Honor," she said, voice even but firm, "the defense would like to submit 2 pieces of evidence into the record." Rohr waved his fingers without looking up. "Go ahead." Maya approached the bench and laid down the first page. "This is a letter from Crestfield Middle School, signed and dated, inviting Mr. Elijah Boone to speak to 8th grade students this morning about public service civic duty and military history." She placed the second document beside it. "This is Mr. Boone's verified military record. 2 tours in Vietnam. Bronze Star. Navy Commendation Medal. 32 years of service. No criminal record. No disciplinary history. These facts establish context. Mr. Boone wasn't loitering. He was fulfilling a civic obligation, one this court now threatens to redefine as criminal conduct." Rohr glanced at the documents briefly, then slid them aside without comment. From the prosecution table, Assistant District Attorney Nathan Hensley let out a quiet scoff. "With all due respect," he said, "no one is denying Mr. Boone's background. But nostalgia doesn't overrule the law. The issue here is public safety and lawful compliance." "Is that what we're calling racial profiling now?" Maya said, not raising her voice. A flicker of tension passed through the room. Hensley leaned forward. "We have footage. Officers received a report and responded according to protocol. There is no protocol for humiliating a decorated veteran on public property without cause," Maya replied. "There is only damage." Judge Rohr cleared his throat. "We'll decide relevance when we proceed to testimony. Right now I need the defense to remain focused on procedure." Maya didn't blink. Understood. But the courtroom had already shifted. Phones vibrated. A buzz moved quietly from one side of the gallery to the other. Unspoken, but palpable. News didn't travel slowly anymore, not in a town like Crestfield. Especially not when a student's video had already crossed 1,000 screens. Officer Liam Grant, seated quietly at the edge of the courtroom, felt his gut tighten. He remembered Elijah standing there, hands open, voice calm, asking for an explanation. He remembered doing nothing. Behind him, a clerk whispered something to the bailiff. Another phone was slipped under the table. Rohr noticed but said nothing. Then the courtroom doors opened. 2 men entered, suited, silent, with nothing in their hands but identification clipped to their jackets. They didn't wait to be announced. They didn't ask permission. They walked with purpose and stopped in front of the bench like they had every right to be there. Rohr blinked. "This is an active court proceeding. Who are you?" The taller of the 2 spoke, voice low and even. "Special Agent Michael Ramirez, Federal Bureau of Investigation." This courtroom is now under immediate review for civil rights violations and suppression of due process. Silence struck the room like a hammer. Hensley stood. You're out of line. This is state jurisdiction. The second agent stepped forward. Not anymore. Ramirez placed a sealed folder on the bench. This contains body cam footage that was removed from the original file submitted to the court. It contradicts the statement entered by Sergeant Rowley and Officer Diaz. The arrest of Mr. Boone was not only unjustified, it was orchestrated. Gasps swept the gallery. The bailiff froze. Even the judge's gavel remained untouched, suspended above his desk, like he wasn't sure what to do with it now. Maya didn't speak. She simply stepped back from the bench, folded her hands, and turned toward Elijah. Elijah Boone remained seated, his face calm, but his eyes locked onto the folder Ramirez had placed. For the first time in 30 minutes, it felt like the truth had entered the room quietly, without shouting, without force. Just presence. No one moved, and then Agent Colton spoke again. Effective immediately, this court proceeding is suspended under federal oversight. All related documentation evidence and personnel are now subject to review. Elijah didn't react. He had learned long ago that justice rarely announced itself. Sometimes it simply walked in uninvited and waited to be recognized. What happened next wouldn't be about courtroom procedure. It would be about what this town had tried to hide. And for the first time in a very long time, no one seemed ready to look away. Judge Charles Rohr's hands hovered over the bench, like he wasn't sure whether to reach for the gavel or hide behind his paperwork. The folder Agent Ramirez had placed before him remained untouched, but its presence loomed larger than any motion or argument that had come before. The room, once rigid with protocol, now held the stillness of something about to split open. Ramirez turned slightly toward the gallery, his tone flat and professional. This file, he said, contains original body cam footage recovered from the internal archives of the Crestfield Police Department. It was previously marked as corrupted in the official record submitted to this court. Our forensics unit found it intact, though it had been renamed and deliberately withheld from standard evidentiary review. Agent Colton opened a slim laptop, connected it to a small speaker, and tapped the touchpad. The screen flickered to life. The timestamp was clear, 8:16 a.m., Lincoln Park. No sound at first, just the shuffle of boots on gravel, then the static-laced audio kicked in. From the rear of the courtroom, someone gasped. It was the unmistakable voice of Sergeant Rowley. "Old black hero wannabe," it said. Low, but clear. "Let's remind him who owns this town." A single sentence, but it cut through the room like a blade. There was no spin, no ambiguity. Colton pressed pause. This segment was deleted in the version provided to the court, as was the audio of Mr. Boone complying without resistance. In total, 23 seconds of actionable dialogue were removed. This is not an isolated issue. Ramirez stepped forward, holding another file. Over the past 18 months, this courtroom has seen 79 complaints from black defendants dismissed without hearing. 5 appeals from federal oversight boards were never recorded into the docket. In each case, the presiding judge was Charles Rohr. The prosecuting attorney was Nathan Hensley. Judge Rohr leaned back. "You have no authority to disrupt a state court." Ramirez didn't raise his voice. "Federal authority overrides when systemic rights violations are evident. Your docket will be audited. Your decisions will be reviewed. Your silence will be documented." Hensley stood. "You're weaponizing procedure. This is harassment." Colton's eyes didn't waver. "You're not on trial, Mr. Hensley." "Not yet." But then Ramirez reached into his coat, pulled out a sealed document, and handed it to a federal marshal who had entered quietly through the rear door. The marshal crossed the courtroom and placed the envelope directly in Hensley's hands. Nathan Hensley blinked. He tore it open and scanned the text. His face shifted slowly, cockiness collapsing into disbelief. He looked to Judge Rohr, but the judge's gaze had dropped to his lap. No support was coming. Colton spoke again. "Mr. Hensley, you are under federal investigation for falsification of evidence, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to violate civil rights under color of law. You are instructed not to leave this courthouse." 2 agents stepped forward. Hensley didn't resist. His mouth opened as if to speak, but no words came. They took him by the elbows and walked him out past rows of onlookers who had once feared his voice. Now they couldn't meet his eyes. Judge Rohr sat frozen. The gavel sat untouched beside him. No one moved to adjourn. No one stood to object. The gallery was silent, not the respectful kind, but the stunned kind. A bailiff quietly excused himself, muttering something about needing air. A clerk closed their laptop and backed away from the table. This wasn't a trial anymore. It was an autopsy. Maya Brooks didn't speak. She didn't need to. She turned toward Elijah Boone, who still sat perfectly still, his back straight, his eyes steady. He hadn't said a word since the FBI walked in, and yet somehow his silence was louder than everything else that had happened in that room. Because justice doesn't always arrive with a speech. Sometimes it arrives in quiet steps carrying truth like a mirror. Ramirez looked toward the judge one final time. We recommend this courtroom cease proceedings until a full federal review is completed. Effective immediately, all previous rulings involving discriminatory practices will be reopened. He didn't wait for permission. He didn't need it. The agents exited the courtroom without fanfare. No sirens, no applause, just the sound of polished shoes on old tile and a door swinging slowly shut behind them. No one followed. Maya placed a hand lightly on Elijah's arm, but he didn't move. He stared forward, not in shock, but with the calm of someone who had long since learned that truth never rushes. It simply waits for people to be ready. The courtroom sat suspended, a place not yet sure what it had become. For a few seconds, no one dared break the quiet. And yet in that space, something had shifted for good. Because when a man is silent, not out of fear, but out of endurance, even the powerful have to listen. And Elijah Boone had not spoken yet. But the whole room now leaned toward the moment he finally would. The courtroom still hadn't moved. No orders were given, no papers shuffled. Even the exit door, still ajar from the agent's quiet departure, stood like an open question. Elijah Boone hadn't stood when Hensley was led away, hadn't flinched when federal charges echoed across the room. He hadn't needed to. But now, as the air settled into a weight heavier than silence, he shifted in his seat and rose slowly, one hand resting on the worn arm of the defense chair. Judge Rohr didn't lift his eyes. He stared down at the bench like it might swallow him whole. The clerk's fingers hovered over the keyboard, uncertain if they were still meant to record. Maya Brooks didn't move, but her hand dropped to her side, as if clearing the space for whatever was coming next. No one gave Elijah permission to speak. He didn't wait for it. "I'm not here to argue law," he said, his voice low but deliberate. "I'm not a lawyer. I've never been a judge. I've only ever stood in front of people when I was told to." A few heads in the gallery turned, including 2 students who had slipped quietly into the back row, their backpacks still on. No one shushed them. No one asked them to leave. "I was 18 when I first wore this uniform." Elijah continued gesturing to his jacket. "Didn't know what the hell I was doing. Couldn't swim. Had never been on a plane. But I believed that if I wore this right, if I served right one day, it'd mean I belonged." He looked down at his hands. Fingers curled with age and memory. "They put a rifle in my hands and sent me to the jungle. I came back with medals. Scars. A spine that won't let me sleep most nights. But when I stepped off that bus, this town wasn't waiting to welcome me. Crestfield had something else ready." He took a breath. Not the kind of breath that steadies you before a fight, but the kind that steadies you because you've already survived one. "It was the fall of '74, he said. 3 months home. I pressed my uniform, shined my boots. I walked back to my old high school, Crestfield Senior, with a note in my pocket from a teacher who'd said I should speak to the history class. Thought maybe some kid would look at me and think he could be something too." A few people in the gallery were already looking down. Some recognized the date. Some recognized themselves. "But I never made it past the front office," Elijah said. "Coach Turner, he had a whistle around his neck and a chip on his shoulder. He said, 'You can't be here dressed like that.' I told him it was a Marine Corps uniform. He told me it didn't matter." The silence thickened, but no one moved to stop him. "I stood by the trophy case when the first rock hit me. Elijah said, voice even. I didn't duck, didn't run, just turned around and walked out. Alone. Like I'd come. Behind him, the two students leaned forward slightly. One reached up and slowly closed the zipper on his backpack without taking his eyes off Elijah. I didn't tell anyone, Elijah said. Didn't make a scene. Just folded that uniform up and put it away. Figured maybe one day when the town had changed, I'd try again. Thought maybe I'd come back with fewer scars and more gray in my hair, and someone might see the person underneath the skin. He looked around the courtroom, not as an appeal, but as a quiet reckoning. This week I got invited back. Different school. Different faces. But the gate was still locked. Nobody dared speak. I don't tell you this to earn pity, he said. I tell you this because some of you were there. Some of you watched it happen. And most of you never asked if it still hurt. The judge hadn't moved. The clerk's screen still blinked, waiting for the next line to be typed. I'm not angry, Elijah said. Anger burns fast. I'm tired. Tired of walking into rooms where people see everything except the service, except the years, except the man. He paused and looked directly at Roar. You don't have to tell someone to leave to make them feel unwelcome. Sometimes all it takes is silence. A cough echoed somewhere in the gallery, then was swallowed by stillness again. Elijah glanced toward Maya, who hadn't looked away once. Then he turned toward the students in the back eyes, locking onto theirs. If you hear anything I've said, hear this being invisible doesn't mean you're not there. It just means they haven't decided to see you yet. He stepped back from the defense table, his movements deliberate. I came back here to speak to a group of kids about courage, about duty, about belonging. And before I could even say a word, I was put in cuffs for sitting in a park. The moment hung in the air, brittle and full. He nodded once, not for approval, not for applause, just a quiet affirmation that he'd said what needed to be said. He returned to his seat without waiting for response. And then a voice rose behind him, soft but unwavering, cutting through the quiet, like a truth no longer willing to stay hidden. The words had barely settled when another voice, smaller, but cutting, rose from the back of the room. It didn't ask permission. It didn't stammer. It came sharp and clear from the mouth of a boy who hadn't been born when Elijah Boone first wore a uniform. He came to teach us, the boy said. And you tried to erase him before he even spoke. Heads turned. A ripple moved through the courtroom. The voice belonged to Jamal Sanders, 13 years old, wearing the standard Crestfield Middle School hoodie, oversized and faded. His hands gripped the wooden rail in front of him, like he needed to hold the room in place. But his face didn't shake. His voice didn't break. He was supposed to talk to us this morning, Jamal said. Our class. I read the flyer. It was up on the bulletin board next to the lunch calendar. We were going to hear what it means to serve something bigger than yourself. He looked around at the adults. But you didn't want that. You wanted him quiet. Judge Roar stiffened. His mouth opened as if to interject, but nothing came out. There was no court officer rushing to remove the boy, no teacher to shush him, no parent standing in the aisle. Jamal was alone. And completely unafraid. He wasn't yelling in the park, the boy continued. I was watching from the window. He was just sitting there, waiting. I saw the cops come up. I saw the way they looked at him like he didn't belong. He swallowed but kept going. And I've seen that look before. Not on me, not yet. But I've seen it land on people who look like my uncle. Like my dad. The gallery had gone still again. But this time not from tension, from something deeper. Recognition. You call it a hearing, Jamal said, but none of you wanted to hear him. You call it justice, but you didn't even ask his name. You saw his skin, and that was enough. One woman in the back put a hand to her mouth. A man near the wall bowed his head. Not in prayer, just shame. Jamal turned toward Elijah. You don't know me, sir, but you came to tell us something, and I think we still need to hear it. Elijah didn't speak. He didn't have to. His eyes met Jamal's, and for a long second neither looked away. Maya Brooks stood slowly, eyes sweeping across the room, not in judgment, but in absolute clarity. She stepped out from behind the defense table and spoke directly to Judge Rohr, her voice quiet but firm. "This hearing is over," she said. "The law may not have finished with Mr. Boone, but the town hasn't heard him yet. And it will!" Judge Rohr didn't respond. He looked worn, smaller than he had when the day began. The bench didn't seem to hold the same height it once did. "We're going to the school," Maya continued. "He's going to give that lecture just like he was supposed to. This courtroom may not be ready for his story, but Crestfield's children are." No objections came. No bailiff moved to block the door. One by one, people began to rise from their seats, not in protest, not in panic, but like something invisible had finally snapped and released them. A quiet line formed near the exit, each person looking toward Elijah as they passed. Some nodded. Others simply looked and kept moving. But none ignored him now. The students stayed back, watching as the room emptied. Jamal remained at the rail, still holding it, still standing taller than his frame allowed. Outside, the crowd that had begun to gather, curious, skeptical, drawn by headlines, was starting to shift. Phones were held lower. Eyes were fixed not on the news vans but on the doors of the courthouse waiting, because sometimes it isn't the verdict that changes a place. Sometimes it's the question a child dares to ask aloud when no one else will. Maya placed her hand on Elijah's shoulder. "Let's go," she said softly. "You've got a room full of students waiting." Elijah nodded once. His silence remained intact. But this time it didn't feel like retreat. It felt like a promise. And as the courthouse doors opened, the air outside didn't feel hostile anymore. It felt expectant, like a town not yet redeemed but finally ready to listen. 2 days later, the Crestfield Middle School auditorium was packed beyond capacity. Folding chairs had been added in the aisles. Teachers stood against the walls. A few parents had managed to squeeze in, pretending to be volunteers. Outside, a small cluster of reporters hovered near the doors, kept at bay by the principal's request for a closed event. The atmosphere wasn't festive. It wasn't tense either. It was charged like everyone inside knew they were about to witness something they didn't have the words for yet. Principal Joan Reeves stood at the front of the stage, hands clasped, eyes scanning the crowd with an intensity that betrayed her usual calm. She hadn't slept much. She'd fielded calls from the school board, the district office, even state officials. Everyone wanted to know the same thing: why she had agreed to let Elijah Boone speak after what had happened. Her answer had been simple: because he should have spoken in the first place. Behind the curtain, Elijah adjusted his collar. The jacket had been cleaned since the hearing. The medals reattached. His spine still ached in the mornings, but today it felt lighter. Jasmine stood next to him, holding a folded piece of paper. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Principal Reeves stepped to the microphone. Today, she began, "You will hear from a man who should have been here earlier this week, a man whose story matters not just because of where he's been, but because of what he still chooses to believe in." She stepped aside. Elijah Boone walked out. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. He just moved with a quiet grace, his cane tapping once for every step until he reached the podium. The room was silent, not restless silent, reverent silent. Then it happened. A single student, second row, stood up and raised his right hand in a crisp salute. Another followed, then 2 more, then dozens. In less than 10 seconds, the entire student body was on its feet, hands to brows in unison, like they'd rehearsed it, but they hadn't. Elijah didn't speak. He looked at them, really looked, and slowly nodded once. His throat tightened, but he didn't let it show. He placed both hands on the podium steady, and then from the back of the room a voice rang out. Young, shaken, loud. We saw everything. The words pierced the stillness. A few students turned to look. Elijah didn't. We saw how they treated you. We saw what they called you. We saw you didn't fight back. You just waited. No one stopped the speaker. No one needed to. We're sorry. That was all. The student sat down. A teacher wiped at her eye and turned, slightly pretending to adjust her glasses. Jasmine remained backstage, her arms crossed tightly, trying not to cry. The weight in the room wasn't shame anymore. It was realization. Elijah leaned slightly forward and cleared his throat. He didn't need a microphone, but it was there. "I was supposed to be here Monday," he said, voice even. But the world had other plans. No laughter, just listening. "I came back to this town because I thought maybe the dust had settled. That maybe this uniform would finally mean what it was supposed to mean. Not fear, not suspicion, just service. Plain and simple." He paused. But sometimes it takes a few extra days for people to hear what they were supposed to hear all along. The students didn't shift, didn't fidget. No one checked their phones. "I'm not here to lecture you," he continued. "I'm here to offer something that got taken from me, a chance to be heard. That's all any of us want. You don't have to agree, but you have to listen." He reached into his coat pocket and unfolded a small, aged note. It wasn't the one Jasmine had given him earlier. It was older, faded, torn at the corner. "This was from a kid I met years ago in a shelter outside Atlanta," he said. He said, "Thank you for talking to me like I wasn't invisible." That's what sticks with people. Not titles, not medals, just the way you treat them when no one else is watching. He placed the note on the podium, gently. "One lesson. That's all I ask you take away. If you're ever in a room where someone's being silenced, ask yourself, what does it cost to listen?" He stepped back. Principal Reeves returned to the microphone, but didn't speak. She simply placed a hand on his shoulder. "Because a lesson doesn't always come with a textbook. Sometimes it walks in slowly wearing an old jacket and changes how a generation sees the past." As the applause built, not raucous but steady, Elijah remained still. The students didn't cheer. They stood taller. And in that room full of young eyes and overdue truths, Elijah Boone was no longer the man they nearly erased. He was the voice they'd never again forget. Now it was time for him to tell the whole story. The room had begun to settle again, the applause fading into a silence that felt less like an ending and more like an invitation. Elijah Boone remained at the podium, one hand resting gently on its edge, the other holding a neatly folded American flag creases sharp corners tight. The cloth was old but clean, the kind given to a mother or a brother when a soldier doesn't come home. He looked down at it, then up at the students in front of him. Their faces were still. Open. Not empty, but waiting. He held up the flag. "This isn't a symbol," he said. "It's a story, and not just mine." What? A murmur moved through the room, but no one spoke. "This flag was handed to me after my closest friend was killed, in Quang Tri," Elijah continued. "His name was David Reyes. He was 23. He died shielding a younger soldier who froze under fire. He never got to finish college, never got to meet the son his girlfriend gave birth to 3 weeks after we came home." He paused, then placed the flag on the table next to him. "I carry this with me because I promised his mother I would," he said. "Every speech, every visit, every moment like this. She asked me to make sure someone remembered." The room had gone still again. Even the teachers who had stood watch near the exits had stopped shifting. "I've carried stories like this one for decades," Elijah said. "Men who didn't come home. Dreams that ended in sand and silence. I've carried their voices because silence is what we were given when we returned." He scanned the room. "We were told to be proud, but we were also told not to speak, told to move on, told to forget." He reached into his jacket once more and pulled out a small, sealed envelope. The paper was new, crisp, unlike the worn letter he had read earlier. He held it up briefly, then opened it carefully. "This came to me 2 days ago," he said. "There's no name, just handwriting. Neat, blue ink, and a short message." He unfolded the paper, flattened it, and read aloud. "You taught me that courage doesn't have to shout. It just has to stand still and stay true even when the world moves against it. Thank you for showing me what truth looks like when it doesn't flinch. He folded the note again, slower this time. I don't know who wrote it, he said. Maybe it came from someone in this room. Maybe not. But I want them to know I heard them. He looked up. That's the thing about truth, Elijah said. You don't need to believe it for it to be real. You just need to let it stand long enough for someone else to see it. A few students shifted in their seats, not out of discomfort, but because they were still processing something they didn't know they had been waiting to hear. I've watched people walk away from stories like mine for years, he said. Not because they hated what I said, but because they didn't want to admit what they already knew. His eyes scanned the auditorium once more. They say time heals. But sometimes time just buries the wound under paperwork and headlines. Sometimes we have to dig it out and look at it again, together, even if it hurts. He stepped away from the podium and took a few slow steps toward the front edge of the stage, the folded flag still resting on the table behind him. I was never supposed to be the one speaking here, he said. Men like me were meant to disappear into the footnotes, to be remembered quietly or not at all. He stopped and looked at the students directly in front of him. But you're here. You're listening. You're proving they were wrong. From the wings, Jasmine watched, arms folded tightly. She didn't blink as he spoke. The man who had raised her never talked like this, not because he couldn't, but because the world had rarely given him the space. This country gave me a uniform and taught me how to fight, Elijah said. But it never taught me how to come home. That part I had to figure out on my own. And some days I still don't feel like I've finished. He turned back to the flag. But this, he tapped the cloth gently. This is proof that someone did. That someone stood and served and didn't vanish. He returned to the podium. This is your classroom, he said. But today it's my battlefield. And I'm not here to fight. I'm here to finish something. He paused, then looked straight out across the audience. Because no one forgets the sound of a voice that finally gets heard. And what came next would not be a story of war or medals or grief. It would be the final message he had carried for half a century, and the one the entire town needed to hear. The air in the auditorium hadn't shifted since Elijah's last word. It held steady, heavy, but not suffocating, quiet, but not hollow. Students sat motionless, as if afraid that any movement might cause the moment to dissolve. At the back of the room, cameras from the local news station remained focused on the stage, but none of the crew dared whisper. Even Maya Brooks, who had stood through combat in the courtroom, now sat near the front row, hands clasped in her lap, eyes fixed on the man who had just told a room full of children what it really meant to carry something that didn't shine. Elijah Boone stood silent at the podium, taking in the stillness, and then he spoke again. Not louder, not slower, just clearer. I've been called a lot of things in my life, he said. Soldier, threat, problem, even boy by men who couldn't carry the weight I did. He scanned the crowd slowly. But the truth is, I don't need to be called anything anymore. Not hero, not veteran, not even guest. He stepped away from the microphone and stood at the edge of the stage, his feet planted like he was preparing to absorb something larger than sound. I don't need to be called a hero, he said. I just don't want any of you to grow up thinking silence is something you're supposed to wear like a medal. The words didn't land like applause. They landed like breath, like something released after being held for far too long. And then the first tear fell. It came from a girl near the center of the auditorium, maybe 13, maybe 14. She didn't try to wipe it away. She let it fall, and beside her another student did the same. Not sobbing, not breaking, just releasing. Around the room, teachers shifted in their chairs. One woman, gray hair, red sweater, pressed a hand to her chest like something inside her had cracked open. Near the back, a man in his 40s stood against the wall, arms crossed. He blinked rapidly, then looked down at the floor. When he glanced back up, his face was wet. No one asked what part of Elijah's words had undone him. They didn't have to. Everyone was hearing something different, but what mattered was they were hearing. "I've walked through battlefields," Elijah continued, "but the hardest fight I ever faced was trying to prove I belonged in my own country. Not in uniform, not behind a flag, just as a man." He gestured gently to the students. "Don't make that fight yours. Don't inherit that silence." There was no noise, just the kind of stillness that follows something sacred. He turned to Maya, briefly, then looked toward the press table where two reporters sat, frozen pens long since paused. "Write whatever you want," Elijah said to them. "Just make sure you write the whole thing." He returned to the podium one last time. "This is not a story about injustice," he said. "It's a story about insistence, about staying here long enough to be heard even if it takes 50 years. He leaned forward slightly. "Because you don't need to survive a war to understand that truth is more valuable than any medal they'll ever pin on your chest." The microphone clicked softly as he stepped away. He didn't wait for applause. He didn't ask for acknowledgement. He turned, picked up the folded flag from the table beside him, and held it under one arm. The room remained on its feet, not as a performance, but as a collective recognition. Not of victory, not of closure, but of presence. As Elijah began to walk down the stairs toward the floor, the crowd parted instinctively. He didn't move fast. He didn't need to. Every step carried decades of silence finally spoken aloud. But just as he reached the end of the aisle, a voice called out, not loud, not desperate, just clear enough to turn every head. "Elijah." It came from a man standing near the doors. Late 60s, neatly dressed, holding a hat in his hands like it might fall apart. Elijah paused mid-step and looked up. Recognition took a beat to settle on his face. The man stepped forward. "I was there," he said. "The day they turned you away from the school, I was standing at the end of the hall. The auditorium didn't stir. I didn't say anything," the man said. "I didn't stop them. I just watched." Elijah didn't move. "My name's Vickerman," the man said. "I was a teacher back then. History." He swallowed. "I never forgot that day." And in that moment, the weight of what had been carried alone was no longer his to bear. Outside Crestfield Middle School, the square had changed. It wasn't just the sunlight slipping into evening or the camera crews setting up across the street. It was the silence, not the kind that follows confusion or discomfort, but the kind that comes when a town finally hears itself think. The crowd had grown. Families stood shoulder to shoulder. Teachers who once kept their heads down now stood taller. A few people from the courtroom had followed Elijah out and remained quietly along the edges. There was no stage, no microphones, just space and a shared understanding that something long buried had been pulled to the surface, and no one wanted to be the first to turn away. Elijah stood near the base of the school steps, Jasmine beside him, Maya just behind. They didn't speak. They didn't move. The moment was no longer theirs to carry. It belonged to the town now. And then through the crowd, an older man stepped forward. Stocky. Weathered. His walk slow but deliberate. He wore a flannel shirt tucked into faded jeans, his badge long since returned, but the shape of discipline still visible in how he moved. "I used to be a cop here," he said, voice graveled but steady. 32 years. Retired 10 years ago. My name's Robert Langston." People shifted. Some recognized the name. Others just recognized the weight in his tone. "I remember the maps we used," he continued, "where we were told to circle patrols heavier, where we were told to look twice at every parked car, at every loiterer." He paused, scanning the square. And I knew what those circles meant. We all did. No one interrupted. No one looked away. "I never laid hands on Mr. Boone," Langston said, "but I did nothing to stop the people who did. I never filed a complaint. I never said it out loud. I just followed orders, went home, slept like it was someone else's burden." His hands clenched once at his sides. "I used to think that made me innocent. It doesn't." A young boy near the front, no older than 12, looked up at his mother and whispered something. She didn't respond. She was too focused on the man speaking, eyes fixed, as if seeing something she hadn't known she needed to see. Langston took another breath. Some of you here used to sit in the back of my patrol car. Some of you I pulled over more times than I can count. And not once did I stop to ask why your name ended up in my notebook more than others. I thought I was doing my job. Now I know I was protecting a system, not people. He turned to Elijah, nodded once, then stepped back into the crowd. Not in shame, but in responsibility. The hush that followed wasn't heavy. It was fragile. Like the space just before a storm breaks, but this time the storm wasn't violence. It was release. From the other side of the square, a woman in her 50s stepped forward. Her voice cracked before it steadied. My father fought in Korea. Came home with half a leg and all his silence. He never told us why he hated small towns. We thought it was the war. Now I wonder if it was the way he was treated when the uniform came off. She looked directly at Elijah. I think he would have wanted to hear you speak. Her voice wavered at the end, but she didn't look away. And no one pitied her. They just listened. Another man stepped out, then another. No titles, no introductions, just stories. Short truths said aloud for the first time. A hallway they remembered. A moment they had turned away. A joke they laughed at and never questioned. Each confession layered onto the one before it, not as an apology, but as an answer to something that had waited too long to be named. Elijah stood quietly among them, never asking, never judging, just receiving, just being seen, because no town is born cruel. Cruelty is a silence that hardens over time passed from one generation to the next, not in screams, but in shrugs, not in slurs, but in avoidance. But now Crestfield was looking itself in the eye, and it didn't blink. A girl from the high school stepped forward, holding a small sign that read, "We will listen. We will speak." A few others followed. And just like that, without permission or prompting, people began writing names on scraps of paper, names of those who never got to speak. Names of those who were lost in silence, names they wished they'd stood up for sooner. They posted them on the school wall, one by one, and when they ran out of tape, they started passing pens. Near the front, a small group of men had begun forming a line. Gray-haired, slow-moving many with pins on their lapels, but no need to name the wars. They weren't there to be thanked. They weren't there to lecture. They were veterans, too, and they had come not to talk about battles, but to stand for the man who had carried theirs without ever being asked. They filled the front row quietly. No flags, no speeches, just presence. And the square stood with them finally wide awake. Back inside the Crestfield auditorium, the lights had dimmed but not gone out. What had started as a guest lecture had become something else entirely, an open forum, not sanctioned by the school board, not scheduled by the principal, but held together by the quiet urgency of a community that had run out of places to hide. Rows of folding chairs were rearranged into a loose circle. The stage lights remained on, but no one stood behind a podium. Instead, Elijah sat among the others, his presence no longer the center, but the anchor. Jasmine watched from just behind her hand, gripping a notebook she hadn't opened yet. Maya stood near the wall, arms crossed, eyes scanning the room like a sentry with no orders left but to witness. The first to speak was a man in his late 70s. He wore a ball cap with a faded 101st Airborne patch and a limp that had clearly outlasted the war that caused it. He didn't give his name. He didn't need to. "I served with Elijah," he said, voice roughened by age and cigarettes. "Didn't know him well. We didn't talk much back then. But I saw him carry 2 wounded men across a ridge under enemy fire. No cover, no backup. Didn't flinch." He looked directly at the younger veterans seated near the front. The war didn't change him. Coming home did. He sat down without another word. Then came a woman from the back row. She wore no insignia, carried no rank, but her voice carried weight. "My brother died after being arrested for something he didn't do," she said. 15 years ago. He had a record, but not that night. They said he resisted. But what he really did was ask why he was being stopped. That was enough. She looked at Elijah. "Your story didn't shock me. It reminded me." Another woman stood. Then a man. One by one the stories came. Not rehearsed, not righteous, just raw. One had been fired for reporting a colleague. One had watched her father erase his accent over the years until he barely recognized his own voice. Another had been 17 when his teacher told him to drop out and spare everyone the disappointment. They spoke not to accuse but to name what had always been there. And then slowly Officer Liam Grant rose from the back. The room stilled. Not because they feared him, but because they knew what his presence meant. Grant hadn't said a word since the courthouse. He hadn't defended himself, hadn't protested. But now, with the weight of silence pressing in from all sides, he stepped forward, his uniform buttoned too tight at the collar, like it no longer fit the man wearing it. "I've worn this badge for 9 years, he began, voice low. "I always thought I was one of the good ones, the kind who de-escalates, the kind who doesn't draw first." He looked across the faces before him, students, elders, colleagues, strangers. But I stood there in Lincoln Park while Elijah Boone was pushed to the ground. I watched it happen. I didn't say a word, didn't radio it in, didn't ask questions. He swallowed hard. I told myself I was just following orders, that it wasn't my place to interrupt a senior officer, but I knew better. I knew what was wrong. His jaw tightened. Then he exhaled. "I want to say I'm sorry. Not because it's convenient now, not because people are watching, but because I was there and I was silent. And I will not let silence be my legacy." A hush followed. Not tense, just heavy, like something had been lifted but not without cost. Grant turned to Elijah. "You deserved better. You still do." He didn't wait for forgiveness. He sat back down, shoulders straight, face unreadable, but something in his posture had changed. Not lighter, but cleaner. Elijah didn't respond. Not yet. His eyes didn't narrow, they didn't soften. They simply held the weight of what had been said and what hadn't needed to be said at all. Maya glanced toward Jasmine, then stepped back, giving her space, because now, after generations of silence, generations of excuses, of missed moments, and muffled truth, the room was finally listening. And it was time for Jasmine Boone to speak. The courtyard held its breath. The final light of day cast long golden beams across the school walls, turning glass into flame and stone into memory. The chairs had been cleared, the microphones powered down, but the story had not yet ended. It lingered in the hush of students who refused to scatter, in the fixed gaze of adults who had run out of excuses, and in the still posture of a man who had carried half a century's silence on his back. Jasmine Boone stood at the front of the crowd, her voice having just traced a line between past and future. She had not raised her tone. She had not asked for applause. But her words had settled like dust in sunlight, visible, weightless, inescapable. Her grandfather sat a few steps behind her head, bowed slightly, not in fatigue, but in reflection. There was nothing left for him to prove. Not anymore. "My grandfather wasn't allowed in this school when he was a young man," Jasmine had said. "Today he stood on its stage. Tomorrow so will we." Those words still hung in the air when Elijah Boone placed both hands on his knees and stood. Slowly. Deliberately. Jasmine turned, met his eyes, and stepped aside without a word. No one called for him to speak. No one needed to. His presence had always been a question waiting to be answered. He didn't return to the stage. He didn't face the crowd from a podium. He walked forward through the students and parents, the teachers and reporters, until he reached the open space near the base of the flagpole. There he paused. The American flag above him rustled gently in the evening breeze, its fabric rippling with the kind of restless dignity that mirrors the man beneath it. Elijah looked up at it, not with reverence, not with resentment, but with something far quieter. Ownership. He turned, facing the crowd. His voice was not raised, but the stillness made it echo. "I don't need to be remembered as a hero," he said. "I just want to make sure no one else has to carry silence like it's a badge." A murmur moved through the group, not sound, but breath like the air itself had agreed. This town, Elijah continued, didn't need to change all at once. It just needed to stop pretending it couldn't. He looked around not at officials or cameras, but at the students. Their eyes met his, and for the first time he could tell they weren't just watching, they were absorbing. Not out of duty, out of understanding. "You will hear people say justice is slow," he said. "But the truth is it doesn't move slow. We do. We wait too long to name what we already know. We get comfortable with wrong because wrong doesn't ask much of us." He stepped forward once more. "But that stops with you." And with that, he said nothing else. He didn't need to. He turned from the crowd and began to walk the edge of the courtyard cane, tapping lightly against pavement, his back straight, his head high. There was no applause, no anthem, no dramatic music or echoing chants. Only silence, but not the kind that swallows. The kind that follows someone you respect when they leave the room. The kind that listens even when words are done. As he moved along the edge of the field, people turned to follow his steps. Not to stop him, just to see him off. Not one person looked away, not out of curiosity, out of something older, respect, recognition. The understanding that a man had just unburdened a truth that never should have been his to carry alone. Jasmine walked beside him a few steps behind, not as an escort, but as legacy. Her eyes stayed forward, shoulders squared, as if holding something steady for the future that had just opened behind them. They reached the base of the flagpole. Elijah paused. The sun was nearly gone now, the sky stretching into deep amber behind the rooftops. The flag above them flapped once sharp and clean. He raised a hand not in salute, not in defiance, just a simple touch to the fabric as it passed overhead. "I used to stand under this flag and wonder if it meant me too," he said, barely loud enough for Jasmine to hear. "Today I don't have to wonder." He let his hand fall and turned away from it. He didn't look back. He didn't need to, because for the first time in his life, as he walked away from that school, from that town, from the shadow of silence, the people behind him saw him. Not as an interruption, not as a threat, not even as a symbol. They saw a man who had never stopped telling the truth even when no one was listening. And now finally they had, because justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it walks slow, speaks once, and then simply remains. Sometimes the most powerful stories don't end with a verdict or a victory, but with a quiet walk into the sunset, when the truth no longer needs to raise its voice. Elijah Boone didn't fight for applause. He stood for something deeper, the right to be seen, the right to be remembered, and the right to speak without fear of being silenced. In a world that often forgets its own lessons, he became a living reminder that silence may last for years, but when truth finally speaks, it echoes across generations. What part of Elijah's journey spoke to you the most, and who in your life deserves to be heard even after years of being overlooked? If this story moved, you don't forget to share it with someone who needs it today, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that shine a light where silence once lived.